Welcome to Never Forget, the part of my channel where I pay tribute to my absolute favorite games and try to explain what makes them so special to me. Today I don't want to talk about a single game, but an entire series. The Legacy of Kain. The Legacy of Kain franchise consists of 5 games that were released between 1996 and 2003. In order of release we have Blood Omen, Soul Reaver, Soul Reaver 2, Blood Omen 2, and finally The Legacy of Kain Defiance. The reason why I can't talk about any of these games on their own is because what this franchise excels at is storytelling, and the Legacy of Kain narrative spans all 5 games to the point where it's incredibly hard to evaluate one without the others. With all of them combined, however, this series has by far my favorite storyline in all of gaming. So let's start a retrospective and get into all of these titles one by one. Don't worry, I will take a detailed look at all the important parts, gameplay, story, presentation and so on, but I will try to keep this video as spoiler free as possible because I do want to give everyone the chance to check out the series for yourself. It certainly deserves your time. And it all begins with Blood Omen 1. The first Legacy of Kain game came out in 1996, made by a company called Silicon Knights. Blood Omen 1 covers the origin of the titular character Kain, a young noble that is assassinated at the start of the game and then resurrected by a mysterious necromancer as a vampire, allowing him to take revenge on whomever killed him. In the search for his murderer, the necromancer leads Kain to the so-called Pillars of Nosgoth, which will soon become the focal point of this entire franchise. Nosgoth is the world Legacy of Kain takes place in, and the pillars represent all of Nosgoth's elements, as well as their delicate balance which keeps the world intact. The so-called Circle, 9 mortal guardians, each responsible for protecting one of the pillars, have gone mad, and through their symbiotic link to the pillars, corrupted them, damning the entire world of Nosgoth to a slow, never-ending decay. Kain is then tasked by the ghost of one of the guardians to kill the entire circle in order to purify the pillars, let them choose new guardians and restore balance. At this very moment in Blood Omen, we already get to see what makes Kain such an enticing character and extremely different from most other video game characters back in 1996. He is a pure anti-hero, arrogant, vengeful and sarcastic.
Out of my way, peasant! The stench of the fields hangs over you like a pall.
The king sees no one. He is in mourning for the princess.
He'll be in mourning for his kingdom soon, and he'll mourn for you even sooner if you don't get out of my way!
He is even unwilling to save the world until the ghost brings up that this task will also cure him from his vampirism curse.
You must restore balance. You must right the pillars of Nosgoth.
I care not for the fate of this world.
Then for yourself, Kain.
Until that is achieved, however, Kain has to live with his lust for blood. Throughout the game, he almost starts reveling in the slaughter he can unleash. I would call him downright edgy, honestly, a trait he shares with a lot of other characters in the game too. This no-holds-barred edginess is actually an important trick used by the writers of Blood Omen, an inspiration taken right from Shakespeare. Back in his time, Shakespeare wrote his plays for 2 different audiences, trying to keep them both happy. He made sure to entertain the peasants in the front rows with vulgar jokes throughout his acts, but also included subtle cerebral metaphors for his more intellectual aristocratic viewers. The creators of Blood Omen applied the same principle. Silicon Knights made sure that players who just want to turn off their brain can enjoy the dark world, feisty remarks and over-the-top gore effects. Take Blood Omen's intro cinematic for example, in which Vorador, another important vampire in the Legacy of Kain universe, attacks part of the circle and murders them in cold blood while they are screaming for the warrior Malik to save them. I vividly remember watching this back when I was a kid, and I'm pretty sure it was one of the most brutal starts to a game I had ever seen. Honestly, this intro still kicks ass, the same way the Legacy of Kain franchise as a whole still kicks ass. Fantastic effects, amazing sound design and top-notch voice acting, delivering so many great lines that are forever etched into my mind.
Call your dogs! They can feast on your corpses!
But beneath this edgy surface lies a narrative that is far more advanced than what most video games offered back in 1996. Next to the outstanding voice performances, the dialogue in Blood Omen is incredibly eloquent and poetic. Kain is strung along on a complex tale with great twists and even time travel elements in which he ultimately has to question the agenda of everyone surrounding him. And not only that, during his journey, Kain also starts reflecting on the very nature of his vampirism. Is it actually a curse or maybe a blessing in disguise? Should he reject these powers of the undead? Is his humanity really worth holding on to, or has he maybe become something greater? This mature storyline is ultimately what made Blood Omen 1 a cult classic back when it came out, and defined the rest of the series, which would later take up these and many other themes and turn them into the narrative I fell in love with. The reason Kain reflects on his condition is that vampires in this world, well, they aren't just your run-of-the-mill vampires. The very first ability you receive as a fledgling bloodsucker is to turn into a fucking werewolf, which okay is somewhat common in vampire mythology, but nevertheless amazing. And it only gets crazier from there. You learn to throw lightning, have people get swarmed and eaten by maggots, take over mines, cast protection bubbles, turn into mist, and so on. Vampires in Nosgoth don't even have to bite other people's necks, they literally force a stream of blood out of an incapacitated body directly into their mouths. The creators of the Legacy of Kain games made it a point to stay on top of all contemporary vampire lore to come up with something unique, and damn did they ever succeed. From the gameplay footage so far, you have probably already realized that Blood Omen 1 is basically a grimdark 2D Zelda. It has a pretty large map that you unlock by gathering new items and powers, with a ton of optional small side areas to explore in between. The great irony of the entire Legacy of Kain franchise, however, and the reason why this video is going to contain a lot more negativity than my other Never Forget videos, is that the actual gameplay has always been this series' weak spot. You have 5 games, all of them with more or less different gameplay, but in none of them is it ever actually, you know, good. Blood Omen 1 is the only isometric 2D game, the rest are in 3D with varying mechanics. However, out of all of them, Blood Omen 1 has, as far as I'm concerned, by far the strongest gameplay in the entire series, so in that aspect we are peaking early and only going downhill from here. Which again is also not to say that Blood Omen's gameplay isn't without issues. And that makes the position I want to take in this video so much more difficult, because while I would recommend the Legacy of Kain series on atmosphere and story alone, it comes with a caveat that you have to go through 5 games of at best decent gameplay quality. Still worth it, but probably a test of patience for anyone who isn't already a fan. Anyway, I think Blood Omen 1 has 2 big problems. Mainly it's that hitboxes and damage indicators in this game are simply fucked. It is never really clear how many more hits enemies can take before they die, and the area of effect of your weapon swings seems to only vaguely correspond with Kain's actual sprite, which often turns combat into a game of exploit the enemy at your maximum range before he exploits you at his. The second issue are loading times. I myself am a very patient man, and I have gotten used to them by now, but in the PlayStation 1 version of Blood Omen, short loading screens even pop up when you try to go into the menu. And in a game that requires so much item and spell switching, that can become incredibly obnoxious, especially considering that due to the game's age, the PlayStation 1 version is the easiest one to get working currently. I still think this game has the best gameplay in the series, however, and it is worth your time. Here's why. Blood Omen 1 manages to use many of its mechanics to service its storytelling in ways that, especially for a game from 1996, I would almost call unparalleled. As I already described, Kain learns to wield a huge arsenal of abilities, and if you use the right spells and items at the right times, most normal enemies do not stand a chance against you, which especially because of the great sound effects feels really cathartic. Nosgoth, however, also manages to be an incredibly dangerous place, even or maybe specifically for a vampire. Everything is out to kill you, not only living beings but the elements themselves. As an undead, Kain takes damage from rain, from snow, from walking through water and swamps. He can poison himself if he drinks the blood of corrupted creatures, and at some point even has to avoid fire coming from the sky. All of this hammers home just how much of an abhorrence of nature Kain has become.
The world had changed to my eyes. I had not expected such cruelty from the light. For in the embrace of the sun I could find no comfort, only malice. This would change in time for the worse, along with other things.
Additionally, over the course of its story, Blood Omen smartly raises its difficulty curve by giving you fewer humans and more demons to fight. Not only because demons are more powerful, humans are the only enemies you can actually drain blood from, which is your main way of healing yourself. In the beginning hours of the game, you come through sleepy cities and villages, and there are more helpless people around for you to feast on than possibly needed. I particularly like the little overflow animation on Kain's life bar when he drinks despite being already at full health, making it very clear that he is literally wasting blood. At this point, you as the player and as a moral human being can decide to just leave all these peasants be and avoid unnecessary bloodshed, thus implying there might still be some humanity left in Kain as well. Later in the game, however, as humans become more rare and otherworldly creatures stand in your way, you suddenly begin to feel the pressure. You start jumping at every single foot soldier and peasant you can find, eagerly draining every little bit of healing blood out of them. But oh no, you are still only at half health. You need to find more. You need to kill more. So as your journey becomes more difficult, the player slowly is turned from this benevolent demigod who lets the little villagers live in peace into a desperate, bloodthirsty predator murdering the innocent for sustenance every chance he gets, mirroring Kain's slow capitulation to the vampiric hunger. It is wonderful how seamlessly Blood Omen manages to make you feel like an engine of death in one moment and as if the world is bent on destroying you in the next. It connects player and player avatar and deepens the exploration of Kain's condition as a vampire, which is what this title is ultimately about. So while the gameplay itself might be clunky, Blood Omen 1 is still an amazing game with some surprisingly well realized themes and a story that blows most other titles of its time out of the water. As the starting point of one of my favorite gaming franchises, it is and always will be a classic. This brings us to the second game in the franchise, the Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. For this one, Crystal Dynamics took over development from Silicon Knights, and Amy Hennig, who had already worked on the first game, became the director. Soul Reaver is a pretty unique sequel in how it continues the story of Blood Omen. Instead of following up directly, Soul Reaver commits to a massive time skip, taking place 1,500 years after the original game. And instead of playing Kain again, we are introduced to a completely new protagonist, Raziel. I want to keep this retrospective spoiler free, but there's one bit of Blood Omen's story I'll have to give away because it's basically the cornerstone of the rest of the series and can't be avoided. Don't worry, even knowing what I'm about to tell you doesn't change the fact that Blood Omen is absolutely worth a playthrough. At the end of the first game, Kain has a decision to make. It is revealed that ever since his birth, he was the 10th Guardian, the Guardian of Balance. After killing all the other Guardians that corrupted the Pillars of Nosgoth, he was destined to offer his own life and fully restore their purity. The player then gets a choice. Kain either sacrifices himself and restores the Pillars, saving the land, or he refuses and embraces his vampirism, leaving them corrupted. Soul Reaver treats the second option as the canonical ending of Blood Omen, and thus establishes a future where Kain becomes supreme lord of a vampiric empire while the Pillars stay corrupted. Now, here in the intro of Soul Reaver, we meet Raziel, one of Kain's 5 lieutenants. It is explained that vampires in Nosgoth have one more power on top of all the crazy abilities they already had. They constantly evolve. Raziel and his clan, the Razielim, were the first among the vampires to sprout wings, even before their master Kain, who, as it turns out, is not happy about this at all.
For my transgression, I earned a new kind of reward. Agony.
He throws Raziel into the so-called abyss, presumably killing him. Raziel, however, after being horribly burnt and disfigured, is snatched out and saved by a giant creature called the Elder God, who claims to be Nosgoth's ruler over life and death. The Elder God tells Raziel that Kain and his vampires need to be stopped, because in their undeath, vampires are unable to truly die, which is obstructing the natural circle of death and rebirth that souls in this world are going through under the Elder God's watch. He then makes Raziel his agent, his Soul Reaver, and gives him a chance to take revenge on Kain and save the world from the vampire scourge that betrayed him. And thus starts the game. Soul Reaver as an entry in the Legacy of Kain series serves a few purposes. In the timeless abyss Raziel was thrown into, the 1500 years I mentioned earlier have passed, and he finds himself exploring a Nosgoth that suffered the never-ending decay Kain's decision to not restore the pillars has brought upon it. There are soulless, mutated undead and crumbling structures everywhere, and the human race has been driven back into a few remaining cities by the vampires. This instills the motivation in player and protagonists alike to find a way to restore the pillars, a goal that ultimately becomes the series' centerpiece. Also, with Raziel, it obviously introduces the second most important character to the franchise and reveals some twists about his origin. But what I think deserves special mention is that we finally have our magical trio installed. Simon Templeman as Kain stole the show last time, and now we have Michael Bell voicing Raziel, as well as Tony J, may he rest in peace, as the Elder God to confront him. These three characters and their unparalleled voice acting are what drives everything. Any scene with either of them, in this and any game to come, is a masterpiece of poetic dialogue, witty exchanges and ever-developing chemistry.
Redeem yourself. Or if you prefer, avenge yourself. Settle your dispute with Kain. Destroy him and your brethren. Free their souls and let the wheel of fate churn again. Use your hatred to read their souls. I can make it possible.
Ask any Legacy of Kain fan what he likes about this franchise, and I have no doubts that voice performances are going to be in the top 3 reasons every single time. And it's not only that particular triangle of characters. You have equally amazing portrayals of other recurring side characters like Vorador and Mobius the Time Streamer and RainaAudron, the mightiest vampire to ever exist, voiced by none other than Odo from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. What? In short, the Legacy of Kain has some of the highest quality voice acting you can find in gaming, and together with the world building and dialogue influenced by classical plays and theater, it very much defines the unique feeling of this entire series, which Soul Reaver 1 is a prime example of. Have I said enough praise at this point? Because here's the thing, I don't actually like the first Soul Reaver. No, I kinda despise it, in fact. It's hard for me to even say that. How can I despise a Legacy of Kain game? Soul Reaver is an essential part of this narrative and the world that I hold so dear. And when it comes to the story, voice acting and music, this game is absolutely fantastic. But the gameplay here is the bane of my fucking existence. Soul Reaver is a 3D action adventure, and that means in this game you either fight shit, you do platforming, or you solve puzzles, and all 3 parts are equally as terrible. Platforming is an easy one to hate here. I mean, it's a PlayStation 1 3D platformer with extremely stiff animations and a camera that you have to constantly wrestle into submission. I almost expect nothing else. Although some of these platforming segments and how far back a failed jump will throw you is truly ridiculous, even for this particular era. The combat, however, is where this game really starts aggravating me, because no matter how I look at it, combat in this game is never ever worth it. The only reason to fight is if you have to kill everything in the room to proceed, which admittedly happens quite often. My problem with Soul Reaver is that you can't just, kill shit. Oh no, trying to finish off an enemy has to be a fucking ordeal. Most enemies don't actually die from attacks, they only ever get stunned and recover quickly. Once stunned, you have to then pick them up and either impale them with a pole weapon or throw them into spikes, water, fire or intense sunlight. Only then will their bodies actually dissolve and you can consume their souls. You have no idea how fucking annoying this gets and how many issues you will encounter here. Not every room gives you a proper weapon to impale monsters with, for example. Raziel's pickup and carry animations are also incredibly slow and you're constantly getting interrupted by other enemies. Aiming to throw someone at a specific deadly spot is also tricky, and all in all, this entire system is just such a hassle when all you want to do is eradicate your opponents and quickly move on. Now, to be fair, there there is another way to finish someone off, and that would be the Soul Reaver weapon you acquire fairly early into the game. The kicker, however, is that you can only sustain that blade at full health, meaning if you enter combat and get hit once, you just lost your one convenient way to finish the fight. Fans of the game will probably tell me the combat isn't bad, just don't get hit, you scrub, it's not that hard. But my reply to that is the following. The only thing I get out of combat is absorbing souls. Absorbing souls heals me and gets me back to full life. If combat needs me to stay at full life the whole time, but it's also the only thing where I will really lose health and my only reward from it is getting that health I lost back, then how would I just ignore this shit entirely, because clearly there's no point to it, especially when combat itself is unnecessarily arduous anyway. See, I would just say fuck the Soul Reaver and carry around a spear with me at all times, but one of Raziel's trademark powers is to switch between the physical and the spectral realms to change the properties of objects surrounding him. He has to use this constantly to progress, which by itself is a really cool feature. But whenever he does this, he loses whatever weapon he was holding, as you cannot physically interact with things from the spectral realm, so just carrying around a spear isn't a consistent combat method either. And that is what really grinds my gears with Soul Reaver. It makes you go through so many hoops to do the simplest stuff. You have to constantly wait for animations to finish, heal up in one realm to get your Soul Reaver back in another, switch back to the physical realm to open doors as you go back and forth because there's so much backtracking and exploration, and it's just so tedious. And don't get me started on the puzzles. I mean, the one type of puzzle in Soul Reaver. The fucking block pushing challenges that seem to be just about everywhere and not only get more complex in every dungeon, but increasingly annoying to deal with too, because Raziel's block pushing animation is so slow and clunky it makes me want to stick a goddamn knife in my throat. See, Soul Reaver is considered one of the true gems of the PS1 and Dreamcast era, and to an extent I guess I understand it. In many ways, this game was mind-blowing back then, the typical Legacy of Kain storytelling being only one of the obvious reasons. The game does feel like it has a truly epic open world that begs the player to explore. It might also be one of the first games to feature a dynamic soundtrack that changes the intensity of the music based on what's currently happening. And of course the implementation of dual world gameplay, in which Raziel can switch between the planes almost whenever he wants to reach new places, was really innovative back then. But man, I can't stand actually playing Soul Reaver. I can't even say it's an age problem, because the following Legacy of Kain games came out within the next few years and are much more enjoyable to pick up. Not to mention Blood Omen 1 released in fucking 1996. Even from a story perspective, this game isn't that important. In terms of actual plot progression, there's very little happening in Soul Reaver. The beginning, the scene in the crypt, and the ending are relevant to this series as a whole, but the remaining 90% are about Raziel hunting down and killing his traitorous brothers that threw him into the abyss on Kain's orders. Which by itself makes sense, but Raziel's brothers are the least impactful side characters in this entire franchise. So despite Soul Reaver 1 being the most popular Legacy of Kain game, despite it being seen by many as the poster child of the series, it affects the storyline this franchise is so well known for much less than the other games. My love for the first Soul Reaver is limited to two things: the understanding of how influential and awe-inspiring it was back in the day, and its introduction of Raziel, one of my favorite video game characters of all time. As that, I accept it as part of the Legacy of Kain family. However, having played it for a third time now for this video, I do not want to touch it ever again. Moving on. Let's go straight to Soul Reaver 2, which released in 2001, just 2 years after the first game. Unlike the transition from Blood Omen to Soul Reaver, this time we don't go through a time skip. Soul Reaver 2 picks up the story exactly where Soul Reaver 1 left it off, except Raziel got entangled in time travel shenanigans at the end of the last game, so Soul Reaver 2, despite continuing the storyline, also takes place many years before Soul Reaver 1. I'm glad we cleared that up. On the hunt for Kain, Raziel enters the stream of time and travels back into a long-gone era of Nosgoth's past. Here he sees the world at a different time that he never experienced himself, one before the corruption. After finding out in the last game who and what he was before Kain raised him to be a vampire, he is now determined to pursue Kain and finally get his revenge. As the third game in the series, Soul Reaver 2 is thankfully a much better game than the previous one. It applies applies some key changes to the formula, making it easier to deal with overall. I usually am the kind of person that argues against streamlining and dumbing down when you go from a game to its sequel. Considering that almost everything about Soul Reaver 1's gameplay was dreadful to me though, simplification seems like just the right idea. No longer do you have to hold a weapon or pick up enemies and throw them into hazards to actually finish them off. You can now hack anyone into pieces with your claws alone. Weapons still drop and give you different movesets, but they aren't mandatory for anything. Most importantly, however, early on in this game, Raziel learns to summon the Soul Reaver at will. It is no longer exclusive to him being at full health. In order to balance this out, the Soul Reaver now comes with a different drawback. Whenever you kill someone while that is active, the Reaver itself will consume the souls of your enemies, preventing you from eating them and healing yourself. Additionally, every soul it consumes arouses the Reaver and charges it up. The higher the arousal, the more damage it will deal, but if it eats too much, it will overcharge and start turning its hunger on Raziel, draining his life instead. I think these changes are fantastic. They are actually well explained within the lore of the game. They build up the Reaver as a separate entity, a ravenous spirit only interested in consuming souls that Raziel has to share his body with. This is incredibly important for the plot and one of my favorite aspects of the entire Legacy of Kain storyline. And in terms of gameplay, these changes add a nice little dynamic to combat that requires limiting your Reaver usage. Ideally, you want to keep the blade at high arousal without it ever hitting the maximum charge, which is quite difficult to balance. And at the same time, you have to be careful to avoid taking damage, since the Reaver will eat up all the souls in your stead when you use it, and fights go on for much longer when you don't. None of these improvements, however, fail to mask the fact that combat is still pretty clunky and, what's worse, still utterly pointless. Because again, the only reward of combat is souls. Souls only heal you, and the only reason why you'd need healing is because you got hit in combat, so it is all in all much more prudent to run past any enemy you see. To be fair, there are still a lot of rooms where you are locked in and forced to fight, and the Reaver improvements are certainly welcome for those sections, but that makes combat still feel more like an obligation than something you intentionally seek out for fun. In terms of area design, Soul Reaver 2 changes a few things as well, and here I can see why some people would prefer the first one. Gone are the sprawling areas that allow for exploration. Soul Reaver 2 has become entirely linear. There are no more secret powers to find, no more extra health upgrades to collect. The world serves only to guide you from cutscene to combat section to cutscene to puzzle room. Given that I enjoy this series for the storytelling in particular, I really don't mind it, but for people who like open worlds, I can see this feeling pretty prohibitive. What also feels a bit cheap is the fact that it consists of relatively few areas overall. You just go through them multiple times in different time periods. See, Soul Reaver 2 tries to hide its linear nature. Over time, you unlock new elemental Reaver powers that can activate certain switches scattered throughout the levels, which will then unlock access to new areas. So early on in your journey, you will, for example, come across this hole in the ground that can only be activated by the Air Reaver way later in the game, which of course you don't know at that point. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about this hole until you actually have the Air Reaver, and at that point the game will have made it abundantly clear what Air Reaver switches look like. So even if you didn't know that this is where you have to backtrack to next, if you just stumble back and forth on the linear path this game exists of, you will eventually notice the obvious switch and continue on. There is no critical thinking involved here, no exploration, not even a slight danger of getting lost. You will get the powers when you need them, and you don't have to worry about them until you got them. In terms of area design, Soul Reaver 2 is definitely the weakest in the series. You can tell from interviews that the Reaver enhancements were supposed to have a much bigger impact on gameplay. They were supposed to have relevant properties, switch up combat, allow for finding secrets and all that, but seemingly just like the previous game, Soul Reaver 2 had to be rushed and suffered a lot of cuts for the final release. It's a shame, really. At least the puzzle dungeons still managed to be a decent challenge. These forges where you imbue your Reaver with the elements are the only parts of the game where it actually sheds its linear nature and gives the player an entire complex to explore, making him work with both spatial and mechanical awareness. Gameplay wise, these are the best parts by far. But no matter what this game does or does not provide in terms of interactivity, the reason why it still works for me is, as always, the storytelling behind all this. You might complain that Soul Reaver 2 reuses so many areas, but Raziel treks through these multiple times because his journey takes him through multiple eras of Nosgoth, and each time the new historical context he finds himself in changes his perspective on things. He gets to know the various actors surrounding the pillars and how they shaped Nosgoth over the centuries. He learns about multiple sides of the conflict and ultimately has to question everyone around him, just as Kain had to do in Blood Omen 1. It probably didn't sound like it so far, but I actually fucking love Soul Reaver 2. It might just be my favorite in the entire series, and the main reason is that it bears the brunt of this series' storyline. The complex nature of this plot is finally revealed. At its core, the Legacy of Kain is a story about time travel and changing your own destiny, which by itself isn't anything new, but these games succeed at something that a lot of other time travel plots fail at, and that is consistency. Look for example at Star Trek, easily one of the greatest franchises of all time, but whenever an episode tries its hand at time travel, it is almost unavoidable that it ends up with a myriad of plot holes. Characters from the present often make assertions and manipulate events in order to create a specific outcome in the past or the future, and whenever they do, it seems impossible that they'd be aware of all the possible ramifications. Take Deep Space Nine's Past Tense, where Commander Sisko accidentally goes back in time and an important revolutionary leader that shaped Earth's past dies because of him. Sisko's goal in this double episode is of course to preserve the original timeline. He takes on the role of that leader and plays his part to stage the events that need to happen in order to keep the present he knows intact. But this never made sense to me. Just by existing in another time, just by talking to, or even just by being seen by other people, he introduces a variable in the past that potentially influences hundreds or thousands of lives. Someone just stopping in the street and having a random thought when seeing Sisko could make that person forget to do something important that day, which in turn could lead to someone else not getting a call, and then someone else not leaving his house in time, and all of that potentially branches out to so many alterations that all of history could be changed. And it's not only Star Trek. Consider a Life is Strange style time traveling scenario, where I leave my house to drive to work at the same time every day, and one of those days I get into a car crash that kills me. Assuming someone else wanted to go back in time to try and save me, all he needed to do would be to delay my departure from home for maybe a few minutes, and the car that would normally kill me would be long gone when I reached the spot where I would have normally crashed. So the notion that characters in Star Trek and many other fictional universes can strategically recreate a timeline that they approve of is pretty absurd, and stories like that have always bothered me. The point I'm trying to get at with all these examples is that Legacy of Kain smartly gets around this problem, and that is one of my favorite aspects of its writing. The LOK universe treats the stream of time, the chain of events that is supposed to happen, as almost unchangeable, and that is explained by a river metaphor mentioned in Soul Reaver 2.
Drop a stone into a rushing river. The current simply courses around it and flows on as if the obstruction were never there. You and I are pebbles, Raziel, and have even less hope of disrupting the time stream. The continuum of history is simply too strong, too resilient.
It is difficult to alter events in this universe, as time keeps rearranging itself to accommodate how things are supposed to occur. Unless that is very specific criteria are met, which by themselves become part of the larger plotline. Then we have the Guardian of Time, Mobius, one of the most important side characters who also makes sure that timelines won't be altered in ways he doesn't approve of. And despite all of that, the rigidity of time, the special rules, the constant interference of all these characters, Soul Reaver 2 and by extension the entire series manages to create some of the most engaging and well thought out time travel plot twists I have ever seen. Without spoiling anything, things are revealed in this game that put even scenes from Blood Omen 1 into a brilliant new perspective. And there is a remarkable consistency across what at the end of the franchise amounts to 4 separate timelines that Kain and Raziel keep jumping back and forth in. It is just masterfully written. Incredibly hard to understand, of course, one of those stories where you have to read 10 pages of summary to make sense of all the details, but once you're familiar with it and all the important parts come together, you can see how carefully everything in here was set up and paid off throughout the 5 games. Together with the high quality dialogue and voice acting, this is the main reason why I hold the storytelling in these games in such high regard. And Soul Reaver 2 is arguably the game in the series where all of these qualities are shown at their peak, which at least for me makes it one of the best and most important out of all of them. With that said, let's move on to the strangest title of the franchise, Blood Omen 2. Blood Omen 2 is the one that most people dislike. It's considered the black sheep of the series, mostly because it doesn't continue the existing storyline. Or at least that's what it seemed like back when this game came out. After 2 games with Raziel as the protagonist, this time we're back to playing Kain. Not however the quote-unquote real Kain, the one we've been following in the previous 3 titles. This series deals with time travel, so naturally there are multiple timelines in this universe. Blood Omen 2 not only creates a new one, giving us an entirely new Kain to play, but also jumps back into a period between Blood Omen 1 and Soul Reaver 1, where Kain is still relatively young and his vampiric empire is currently at war with the human race. In the original timeline of the first 2 games, Kain of course wins this fight, which is why in Soul Reaver 1 Raziel sees humanity mostly obliterated, driven back into a few remote cities. In Blood Omen 2's timeline, however, things play out differently. This time, the so-called Seraphim, a recurring order of vampire hunting knights, are led by a mysterious individual only known as the Seraphim Lord, who in a decisive battle manages to beat Kain, seemingly killing him. Blood Omen 2 then begins with Kain waking up with a mild case of amnesia years later. He finds himself in a world that, after he lost the war, is now reversed, dominated by the humans, with the vampires reduced to a few woefully outmatched resistance groups. The Resistance persuades Kain to help them, and so he sets out to discover who the Seraphim Lord is, to kill him, and to rebuild his empire. The problem right off the bat here is that all of this feels more like a spin-off game than a full-fledged entry into the Legacy of Kain franchise. Blood Omen 2 released just 1 year after Soul Reaver 2, which itself ended on a massive cliffhanger, and here we are going through some weird alternate timeline with a different Kain and no Raziel. There are some characters that come back, but in 2002 it was entirely unclear how this game even fit into the main storyline. As a matter of fact, it needed the next game, Legacy of Kain Defiance, to retroactively explain how the events in Blood Omen 2 were even connected. In fear of spoilers, I can't elaborate further on that, but rest assured that despite 1 or 2 plot holes, this game does eventually become part of the broader story. Gameplay wise, Blood Omen 2 is comparable to the Soul Reaver games, but with much less emphasis on platforming, instead focusing more on combat. The premise of this timeline is that vampires lost the war, making them the vulnerable underdogs this time, and Blood Omen 2 incorporates this in multiple ways. For one thing, this is the first and only Legacy of Kain game that has stealth. In certain areas, Kain can turn into his mist form and instantly execute enemies from behind, which lets you thin their ranks before taking on the rest directly. Thematically, a lot of the missions also reflect the guerrilla-style tactics commonly used by resistance groups. You travel through a lot of dark alleys and slums, often taking secure routes through sewers, over rooftops, and even taking a detour through barely populated canyons later on. Multiple times you also have to seek out human turncoats that work as informants for the vampires and rely on them, which is quite a subtle tonal shift from previous games. Blood Omen 2 also does a great job of actually making the enemy forces feel intimidating, nicely ramping up their skills and damage as you go along and making sure you only fight a few enemies at a time, reflecting the stealthy nature of your objectives. The combat itself, however, does have some issues. It's fairly clunky, and even for a game that's 15 years old now, has a lot of awkward animations that lack punch. Fighting is fairly slow and methodical, built around a rather simplistic approach of waiting to block, then attacking, and sometimes grabbing enemies when they've exhausted themselves. Some enemies make you block 3 times in a row, some 5, some have occasional unblockable attacks you need to dodge, but every single enemy in the game, whether it's a knight or a spectre or a spider, is essentially just about dealing with a mixture of these patterns. Probably the most important feature is that with every successful block, Kain fills up an extra meter spent on unblockable special attacks. When you build enough bar, this essentially gives you you access to an unavoidable boost of damage you can distribute among all opponents, which by itself could lead to a cool bit of resource management. The problem is that Blood Omen 2 is a game that rewards defense way more than offense, which makes you overly reliant on these moves. Fights tend to drag on when you don't use your special skills all the time, as it is difficult to damage enemies consistently with your normal strikes. Whether opponents will end up blocking an attack or not often feels random and unpredictable already, but if they do actually end up guarding on the first hit, then you can spam your basic attack as much as you want. You are not getting through that defense. So the cleanest way to kill anyone is to just wait it out and block, fill your meter, and then use your guaranteed unblockable attacks over and over. It definitely gets boring after a while. A nice change that Blood Omen 2 brings to the series is the addition of a rudimentary XP system. Sucking blood, or in the case of Raziel's souls, was so far only ever used for healing. In Blood Omen 2, every fully drained enemy also fills up a small part of an extra bar, which once it is maxed out resets and increases your maximum HP. Additionally, all throughout the levels you can find vampire artifacts that give you a ton of XP at once. So consistently building up your maximum life in this game outright requires you to A, kill and suck blood from every single enemy you meet, which is thematically appropriate for a character like Kain, and B, to actually explore the corners of every level in search for artifacts, which is good design. An approach that the Soul Reaver games royally failed at. Soul Reaver 1 wasn't difficult enough to warrant looking for all the secrets, while in 2 there weren't even any. And in both games combat was never worth it because there was no lasting reward. Blood Omen 2 corrects both of these. Well, at least in theory, because in practice there's one thing I majorly take issue with. It just takes too fucking long to draw blood from dead enemies. No, seriously, that is my biggest problem with Blood Omen 2. It takes too long to drain just a single enemy in a game where you fight hundreds of them. And that's not even mentioning all the countless commoners that you can hunt down in most levels. You want to kill everyone just for that extra bit of XP, but it gets so tedious after the first few levels. I've honestly never seen a case where such a trivial and mundane mechanic manages to outright kill the entire pacing of a game. Really, I don't think me just talking about it can accurately convey how annoying this gets. Okay, so far it might have sounded like I'm overly shitting on Blood Omen 2, but to be perfectly clear, I do actually like this game, and in my opinion most Legacy of Kain fans don't give it enough credit. Because despite those pacing issues and some minor timeline inconsistencies, there are multiple things here that I feel it does really well. The series' trademark high level of atmosphere, voice acting and dialogue is as strong in Blood Omen 2 as ever. Kain is the usual arrogant prick that you've come to love, but taking on the role of the underdog in this game leads to a series of neat personal conflicts, since he and the vampire resistance group work towards the same goal but don't necessarily trust one another. Level variety is also at an absolute high point for the franchise. Half of the game's missions show you the massive city of Meridian from many different and well realized sides, whether it's slums, docks, religious or industrial quarters. All of them build a dark and believable steampunk era within the Legacy of Kain timeline. The second half of the game meanwhile goes completely off the rails, but in a good way. The Legacy of Kain franchise never did areas like the Eternal Prison or the Hidden City before or after this game. They're strange and alien places, but for a franchise that is so intentionally unpredictable, it fits extremely well in my mind. All of these areas manage to create the wonderful feeling that throughout its entire playtime, Blood Omen 2 will always have something cool and surprising in store for you next, and it keeps you going. Probably the highlights of this game, however, are the boss fights, and they are arguably better in this than any other title of the series, because they're actual boss fights. Every single one of these encounters has multiple phases, alternating between combat sections and little puzzle-esque scenarios in which you have to figure out a way to harm the boss using Kain's various abilities. Every boss battle feels like you're actually up against an intelligent creature that will adapt to you over the course of the fight. Let's look at an example. The boss you meet in the industrial quarter starts with a one-on-one combat phase in which you have to continuously burn him by keeping him in range of seething steam coming into the room. Once that is over, he will try to run along the walls and attack Kain with a fast jumping kick that is unstoppable unless you manage to position a beam of energy in the middle of the room between the boss and you when he's about to strike, all the while avoiding the ongoing steam. After that, when he realizes his efforts so far have been fruitless, the boss attempts to overload the machine in the room and destroy the artifact that you came to collect in the first place. At this point, he will actively avoid fighting you and stay out of range. As a counter, you then have to mind control a nearby worker, use him to activate the burning gases again, and force the boss to confront you on an elevated platform, which finally makes it possible to kill him. It is incredibly satisfying to overcome such an elaborate encounter, and every single boss fight in the game manages to come up with multiple unique phases. The bosses also have a personal connection to Kain's past before he was defeated by the Seraphim Lord, and after killing them and taking their soul, it unlocks a new ability mirroring a power that these bosses were just using against Kain. All of that makes these fights very memorable, and for a series that generally struggles in the gameplay department, the boss fights in Blood Omen 2 are genuinely my favorite bit of interactive design throughout all of these games. So despite it being the black sheep of the franchise, despite its connection to the main storyline being hard to figure out, despite not featuring Raziel, the Elder God, or Mobius, Blood Omen 2 still has positive qualities that it brings to the Legacy of Kain franchise, and for that I admire it. Moving on. Finally, we are at the last game of the series, the Legacy of Kain Defiance, and this one comes with pretty big changes. So far we had 4 Legacy of Kain games, 2 Blood Omens in which we played Kain and 2 Soul Reavers in which we played Raziel. In Defiance, the storylines finally truly converge, and now we play both, alternating between them from chapter to chapter. The combat has also been massively changed, turning what used to be a 3D adventure into a more combo-focused character action game with a fixed camera perspective in every room. Now, after Blood Omen 2 goofed off with alternate timelines, Defiance picks up the original plot again and acts like a true sequel, beginning shortly after the end of Soul Reaver 2. In terms of story structure, most of Defiance is spent in one of 2 ways. Raziel and Kain will either explore ancient vampire ruins, discovering the backstory of their race, or they will travel to and meet up with side characters well known from the previous games. Defiance introduces very few story aspects that are completely new. It is instead more interested in tying already existing elements together, and after 4 games and so many open questions, that is very much appreciated. In many ways, this, as well as the fact that you play both Kain and Raziel, makes it feel like a best of Legacy of Kain game. However, that is not meant as an insult. Thanks to its time travel aspects, the story of the series has always been circular and self-referential by nature, but without it ever feeling forced or self-congratulatory. There definitely is a purpose to every single scene in here. So let's talk about the gameplay. In Defiance, the Legacy of Kain series once again honors its proud tradition of taking one step forward and one step back, fixing a bunch of problems that the old games had while at the same time inviting a whole set of different issues with the new approach. It really is a shame because on the surface I love this new action-oriented combat system. Kain and Raziel retain their normal abilities, light attack, heavy attack, telekinesis and so on, but all attacks now have a lot more combo and juggle potential, while all animations are snappier and more impactful. Even blood and soul sucking can now be done mid-fight with quick finishing moves. Making combat more stylized and increasing the speed and fluidity of everything actually fits very well with this universe, as Kain and Raziel have always been incredibly powerful creatures. In general, Defiance is the game to finally fix Legacy of Kain having clunky gameplay, and boy was it about time. Another addition is the inclusion of a special move that can be unleashed after charging up your sword. Unlike Blood Omen 2, the focus here is on offense though, not defense, as your sword charges up with every successful strike. The properties of your special move change depending on what element of the Reaver blade you currently got equipped, and given that there are multiple different elements for both characters, this potentially adds a lot of possibilities to combat. Unfortunately, all of these end up being either uninspired or straight up gimmicky. 75% of special moves are just some form of big damage AoE. It really doesn't matter if I'm doing damage and also freezing everyone around me, or burning them, or attacking anything on screen by turning into a ghost. Most enemies will just die on the initial hit anyway. Those are the uninspired ones. The gimmicky moves meanwhile don't even deal damage and instead lead to other effects that are way too circuitous for such a simple combat system. Like, why would I ever use the charged up Darkness Reaver to turn invisible during combat and formulate some kind of attack strategy when it's much quicker to destroy everything on screen with a huge fuck off explosion? And here we touch on one of the bigger problems of Defiance overall. Great animations and flow cannot mask the fact that the combat is overly simple and becomes repetitive quickly. For one thing, both Kain and Raziel have almost the same exact basic moveset. Same 3-hit attack, same launcher, same air combo options, so even though you're constantly alternating between the two, you're still going through the same kind of combat all throughout the game. Enemy variety is decent, but enemies also do very little damage, so there's rarely any strategy involved. Defiance simply doesn't give you enough tools to keep things fresh for the amount of fighting you have to do. And that is a shame, because again, the general more action-oriented approach feels like the right one. It just needed fleshing out. The tedium of Defiance's gameplay also stems from the game's repetition of content. What's really weird about this game is that it is extremely backloaded, with multiple important boss fights that shake up both story and combat happening in the last 20% of the game, one almost right after the other. The first 80% meanwhile, especially on Raziel's side, lead him to ancient temples multiple times, and they end up feeling very samey. For one thing, because all of them reuse the same art assets, and for another, because at the end of every temple you fight 1 or 2 spirit guardians that Raziel has to defeat in order to enhance his Reaver with their elemental powers. These spirits have extremely simplistic movesets, and even with slight variations to these fights, there is no justification for them to be repeated 4 times. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to imply all you do in this game is run through crumbling temples and do combat. There's still puzzle solving and there's still platforming, although because of the awful fixed camera positions in some of these rooms, the platforming aspect can also become incredibly frustrating at times. But what I really like about Defiance are the general level layouts. Every single area outside of the occasional temple is large and complex, often teasing you with the exit of the level early on, but making you explore to find a way and reach it. Most of these areas have just the right size, keeping the game's storytelling linear, but giving you a nice open space with multiple paths within each chapter. Some of these levels really stand out in terms of complexity. In Vorador's mansion, for example, which you initially enter from the front yard, you soon come across a well that needs to be activated with multiple artifacts scattered throughout the villa. So you start going through the basement, solve some puzzles, search the backyard, enter the house again. At some point even make it back outside to the front yard, but this time on a balcony level where you need to change between realms to make certain jumps across pillars and roofs possible, and it's just such a satisfying area to figure out. Where Blood Omen 2 has my favorite levels thematically, Defiance is definitely my favorite in terms of actual level design. So, there are some ups and downs in this game, some things are really good, some parts are lackluster. Ultimately, I'd still only call Defiance's gameplay decent. However, and I know I've said this about all of these games now, but that's also kind of the point of this entire retrospective, when it comes to the most relevant aspects of the Legacy of Kain series, the story and atmosphere, it is as magnificent as ever. With Defiance's story being so self-referential and most important characters showing up at some point, you really get the entire package of voice acting talent in this game.
Yes, I am changed. I have become a god, greater than you ever were, Raziel. You were never a god, greater even than Kain. No! I must have blood. Bring me blood, or feel the wrath of your god. Yours. Yes, it will
Strengthen me against them.
For the plot, meanwhile, there aren't many details that I can still divulge, because at this point just about anything would be a spoiler, but in Defiance the series again manages to recontextualize multiple events from previous games, even some from the original Blood Omen, and works them into new twists and turns. It is just wonderful. No matter what gameplay issues I possibly had, the story, music and cutscenes alone compelled me to play through this game yet another time. I was always looking forward to the next bit of dialogue, to every single sentence, every little back and forth between these characters and their struggles. I really don't think I've sufficiently made clear how much I love the Legacy of Kain dialogue. How I, who has played these games multiple times, would often watch a cutscene and then end up rewatching it in my recorded footage because every exchange just felt so rich with information. And this franchise is so infinitely quotable too. There are countless great lines here that I simply can't get out of my mind anymore, like Kain's infamous coin toss analogy, symbolizing his continuous fight against the odds.
You said it yourself, Kain. There are only two sides to your coin.
Apparently so. But suppose you throw a coin enough times. Suppose one day it lands on its edge.
Some of them are straight up memes now, like Kain is deified and Ve Victus, and for some of them I even wonder if they haven't been inspiring games that came way later.
I have seen the future, Kain. You are not in it.
I have seen the future. You're not in it.
Now, despite Defiance being the last Legacy of Kain game, it doesn't actually bring full closure to the storyline. It does finish up multiple character arcs and integrates the events of Blood Omen 2 into the overall plot, but ultimately it does not end properly. A quick bit of research on Google, as well as, common sense, suggests that there was at least one more game planned after this. Defiance, however, had failed to meet the publisher's sales expectations, despite selling somewhere between half and a full million of copies, and after the game's release, the series director Amy Hennig left Crystal Dynamics. Production on the 6th game was started, but 3 months into the project it was cancelled and the series put on hold. That was 2004, and that is where we still are today. A few years ago, some people at Crystal Dynamics stated that there still is a chance that Legacy of Kain might be picked up again though. So I guess the question to be asked is, should there be a new Legacy of Kain game? And my answer is, one of the biggest fans of the franchise who cares enough about it to make an entire retrospective video is fuck no! There are so many reasons in my mind why a 6th game just wouldn't work anymore. After almost 15 years of inactivity, this series has become a cult classic that only appeals to a small hardcore fanbase and no one else. Just from a financial standpoint, it is questionable how many people would even be interested in a new entry. Even if we were to assume that Square Enix would greenlight a new title and it was made by developers who deeply care about the franchise, I don't think there's any possible way they could write a satisfying conclusion to this story while keeping all the elements intact that made this series so great. What people love about the Legacy of Kain, what defines it, is rich, complex storytelling and unrivaled voice acting. The series director Amy Hennig has long been working on different projects, so it's very unlikely she'd be getting involved again, which is a dent on the writing front already. Meanwhile, the voice of Raziel, Michael Bell, is almost 80 now, and more importantly, the voice of the Elder God, Tony J, passed away back in 2006. You can't replace these voices. They are the characters that the fans of this series love. And honestly, just look at the timeline chart. Does this look like any writer would want to entangle it? Does it look like something that some executive would want to touch 15 years later for the sake of name recognition? Of course not, which is why the only recent game that had any connection to the Legacy of Kain universe, Nosgoth, was a free-to-play multiplayer game that didn't even make an attempt at picking up the story again. The developers of Nosgoth specifically set their game in some weird time period between Blood Omen 1 and Soul Reaver 1 and made up a bunch of nonsensical fanfiction bullshit to justify the existence of some of their classes in the game. And since it was an unexplored period in the timeline, they could always fall back on the excuse of, yeah, well, we simply don't know what happened in this time, so our version might as well be true. No, the Legacy of Kain relies on a certain set of brilliant voice actors and a certain set of brilliant different writers working together, and it is pretty much out of the question that something this unique could be faithfully recreated. And if you can't, with a franchise that is defined by its narrative and its characters, and that no one but hardcore fans even cares about anymore, what would be the point of making another game? The only thing you could do with this series is reboot it, and that would most likely mean turning it into some cynical, modern, edgeless, generic AAA cash cow. Something that has nothing to do with the original vision anymore and that fans like me would undoubtedly hate. You want proof of that? Look no further than Legacy of Kain, Dead Son. Another terminated Legacy of Kain title that was worked on around 2011 and that had some gameplay footage leaked a few years ago. I don't want to go too into detail on this game, but what we can see and piece together about Dead Son is exactly what I've been saying up until just now. It seems to have almost nothing to do with the original games. It looks nothing like them, it sounds nothing like them, it's about entirely new people as well. And where Legacy of Kain had poetic intelligent writing about characters pondering the concept of free will, Dead Son's footage shows witch hunters who have their tits hanging out, who talk about limp dick kings and spout swear words in every other sentence.
Fuck you, fat boy. This is the sublime moment of our undoing, Raziel. Fuck you, fat boy.
I would choose oblivion over this existence.
Fuck you, fat boy.
It is heartening after all these years to hear my name spoken without contempt.
Fuck you! Fuck you!
This is what Legacy of Kain was supposed to become? This prepubescent nonsense that lacks all the eloquence and wit of the original? Fuck that. I'm glad that Legacy of Kain ended when it did, and quite frankly, I hope it stays that way. I love this series for what it is. I want it to remain this unique piece of gaming history that I get to admire for as long as I live. And if you have been staying with me through this entire retrospective, then my hope is that you will try it out too, and that you will join me in my love for the Legacy of Kain. Bouken, signing out. Hey, this is where I want to make a little addendum. As some of you might be aware, Crystal Dynamics on their official Twitter account tweeted out an image and a quote of Raziel the other day, and since that is somewhat uncommon, people started believing that maybe they are teasing some kind of new Legacy of Kain game. And that for me is of course very ironic considering what I said at the end of this video. Now, I wrote the script and did the voiceover for this video long before that tweet happened, but I just want to state that I stand behind every word I said. I do not believe any kind of remake, any kind of reboot, any kind of sequel would work out for the Legacy of Kain series, and if that is where they are going with this, then I can only hope I'm gonna be proven wrong. Also, I am aware that Amy Hennig's Star Wars game was recently put into the dirt, and, you know, does that mean that she might be coming back to the series? I find it unlikely, as I would have to assume that if that's what's happening right now, they would have to do planning and pitching and pre-production way before right now for them to be already teasing this on Twitter, so yeah, it seems unlikely to me. And the last bit of speculation I want to indulge in is that maybe where this is going is some kind of Legacy of Kain collection. You know, all 5 games at a cheap price and working on current gen systems. If that is where they are going, then, you know, you could color me pleasantly surprised, because these games being so old, they are definitely a bitch to get running currently. So that would be pretty great. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like and subscribe to my channel. I have a bunch of other videos coming up. Well, soonish. I don't want to make empty promises, but I'm definitely working on them. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @BoukenJima_. I am super active on there, and you know, you can chat me up about the Legacy of Kain anytime. Otherwise, I hope to see you on my next video, and until then, bye bye.